The ledger came to light by pure accident on a blistering August afternoon in 1897, when a fire ripped through the east wing of the Crane Mansion in Fort Wayne, Indiana. As servants scrambled to rescue valuables, one stumbled onto a hidden compartment behind what looked like a regular bookshelf. Inside was a leather journal, its pages neatly divided into 3 columns filled with names, dates, and places. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for family records, but it was nothing of the sort. The first column listed over 400 men, women, and children who had vanished from nearby counties over the past 15 years. The second recorded the dates of their acquisition, while the third, most chilling of all, marked their deaths with a single word: processed. The servant who discovered it later swore the pages gave off a metallic, foul stench, like the smoke from the steel mills by the river. Authorities seized the journal quickly, but within days the investigation was shut down without explanation. For 3 years, the truth about Bartholomew Crane lay hidden beneath layers of money, power, and fear. What happened next would unravel one of the Gilded Age's most celebrated success stories, exposing how one man's unrestrained appetites birthed horrors that outshone the darkest corners of American history. In the 1880s, Fort Wayne thrived on industry, its railroads booming with the steel and machinery that fueled a young nation's rise. At the center of it all was Crane Steel Works, employing thousands and producing some of the finest steel west of Pittsburgh. Its owner, Bartholomew Crane, was a towering figure standing 6'3", with striking blue eyes and silver hair that gave him the presence of royalty. Raised on a small farm in Ohio, he clawed his way into wealth, and by 1885, at just 38 years old, controlled a vast empire of steelworks, farmland factories, and a railroad line stretching to Chicago. Worth more than $2 million, he ranked among the industrial elite of his age. But what truly set him apart wasn't just his fortune, it was his scandalous personal life. Unlike the hidden polygamists of Utah, Crane flaunted what he called his extended family, made up of multiple wives and dozens of children spread across grand estates. The heart of this arrangement was Crane Manor, a 40-room Gothic revival mansion, perched above the Maumee River, where 7 wives and 23 children lived under one roof. Each wife commanded her own wing, complete with private sitting rooms and nurseries. And each relationship was formalized through spiritual matrimony contracts that guaranteed them financial security in exchange for loyalty to the household. Beyond the manor, Crane kept 6 more estates across Allen County, expanding not just his empire of steel, but also his empire of family. Bartholomew Crane's empire didn't stop at his fortress-like manor. Scattered across Allen County were smaller estates, each worth a fortune on its own, and each home to what he called his secondary families. These women, who preferred a quieter life away from the spectacle of Crane Manor, still bore his children and lived in comfort under his protection. Willowbrook Farm, 20 miles south of Fort Wayne, housed 5 wives and 16 children. Riverside House, a mansion along the St. Mary's River, sheltered 4 wives and 12 children. Every estate was a carefully managed world, complete with servants, tutors, and governesses who ensured Crane's children received the best education money could buy. What made all this so extraordinary was how openly it was carried out. Crane paraded different wives at social gatherings, appeared in church pews with rotating groups of children, and hosted extravagant parties where his sprawling families mingled as though it were the most natural thing in the world. At first, Fort Wayne society was scandalized, but as the years passed, admiration replaced shock. His wives, all graceful and well-educated, projected an air of contentment. His children were neatly dressed, courteous, and consistently top of their classes. Newspapers fawned over the family, with the Fort Wayne Gazette praising the wives for their charitable works and the Indianapolis Star publishing glowing interviews with the older children. Even clergymen, after initial hesitation, began framing Crane's arrangements as a form of Christian benevolence, pointing out how he provided stability for women who might otherwise have been left destitute. Businessmen envied his ability to keep harmony among so many strong-willed women, often joking in their clubs about his remarkable diplomacy. When pressed for his secret, Crane would smile and say he treated each wife as though she were the only one, and in return he earned their undivided loyalty. But beneath this carefully polished surface were cracks that hinted at something far more sinister. Some wives admitted there were sections of the manor that no family member was allowed to enter. They mentioned midnight deliveries, strangers appearing at odd hours, and locked basements no one dared question. When reporters pressed them on these details, their expressions shifted from polite smiles to uneasy silence. Even the children let slip unsettling remarks. 10-year-old Edmund told a friend that his father had a special place where bad people went to learn how to be good. 12-year-old Margaret confided to her tutor that she sometimes heard sad singing drifting up from beneath the library floor. When adults confronted them later, the children claimed not to remember what they had said. Servants and laborers reported even darker signs. Maids whispered about bloodstains on clothing from the manor's restricted wings. Groundskeepers noticed strange machinery delivered to hidden basement entrances. Cooks questioned why massive amounts of food were prepared each day, far more than the known residents could ever consume, though no large gatherings were announced. The wives themselves, though seemingly content, showed subtle signs of unease. They rarely ventured out alone, avoided speaking of their lives before joining Crane, and most tellingly had no contact with any family of origin. Crane explained this by claiming his wives had been orphans or estranged from relatives who rejected their unconventional lives. By 1890, however, Crane's public image remained untouchable. He was admired as an industrial visionary and a domestic innovator. His name floated in newspapers as a possible candidate for governor of Indiana. He was celebrated as a man who had solved the timeless problems of poverty and loneliness by defying tradition. Yet in the poorer quarters of Fort Wayne and in the makeshift camps of drifters along the railroads, darker stories circulated. Men who had applied for jobs at Crane Steelworks vanished without a trace. Strangers whispered about shadowy figures roaming the city's immigrant neighborhoods, offering desperate families promises that seemed too good to refuse. Ads for domestic positions at Crane's estates led to families disappearing entirely. These tales might have been dismissed as the ramblings of the downtrodden, if not for the night in October 1890 when a storm rolled across Fort Wayne, and the first visible crack split Bartholomew Crane's empire of wealth, family, and control. The Midwest's industrial boom created a hunger for labor that left most factory owners scrambling to lure workers with bonuses and higher wages. Yet at the Crane Steelworks, staffing was never a problem. While competitors fought to fill shifts, Crane's foundries always seemed full, with new men appearing as though conjured from thin air. They worked hard, accepted below-average wages without complaint, and vanished just as quickly as they arrived. When asked how he managed it, Crane would flash his aristocratic smile and insist that his reputation for fairness drew the best men from across the region. But behind this polished explanation lurked something far more disturbing. Thomas O'Brien, a veteran foreman with 8 years at the steelworks, was the first to notice that things didn't add up. Unlike other factories where men built friendships and formed communities, Crane's workforce was strangely rootless. New faces came and went with unsettling regularity. At first, O'Brien chalked it up to the brutal demands of steelwork men moving on when they couldn't handle the heat and strain. But the pattern refused to make sense. Skilled German and Irish immigrants disappeared just as suddenly as green farm boys from nearby counties. Even men O'Brien knew personally, men saving for homes, men planning to bring their families to Fort Wayne, simply evaporated. When O'Brien tried to trace them, he found nothing but dead ends. Their boarding house rooms were wiped clean, leaving no trace of their belongings. The railroad clerks had no record of tickets purchased in their names. And when he sought out their families, he was shocked to discover they had received carefully written letters claiming the men had found better opportunities elsewhere. The letters were convincing, filled with personal details only the men themselves should have known. Yet O'Brien's trained eye saw something unsettling. Though the handwriting varied, the letters carried subtle similarities, as if penned by a single hand, hiding behind clumsy disguises. Even more disturbing, some included details the missing men had only ever confided to O'Brien in private conversations. Determined to uncover the truth, he began a quiet investigation of his own. He lingered long after his shifts ended and arrived before dawn, watching the edges of the steelworks that most employees ignored. What he saw chilled him. In the dark hours between shifts, horse-drawn wagons rolled up to a back entrance, their drivers heavily cloaked even in mild weather. The wagons carried groups of people, men, women, even children who stumbled forward as if drugged or half asleep. They were led into a section of the plant O'Brien had always believed was reserved for raw material storage. None of them emerged during daylight. Instead, different men appeared in the foundries dressed in the same work clothes and carrying the same lunch pails as those who had vanished into the restricted building. They bore no resemblance to the people O'Brien had seen arriving in the wagons. The realization gnawed at him. Whatever was happening inside those walls was replacing human beings' with something else. Something efficient, obedient, and utterly disposable. O'Brien's investigation reached its breaking point on a pitch-black November night when he resolved to follow one of the mysterious wagons. Creeping through back roads under cover of darkness, he trailed it for nearly an hour before it veered off onto a private drive leading to the looming silhouette of Crane Manor. Concealed among a cluster of oaks, O'Brien watched as the wagon halted at a basement entrance. The cargo it carried was nothing like the weary laborers he had expected. Instead, a dozen figures emerged. Women in fine dresses, frail elderly couples, and several children moving with the heavy, stumbling gait of those sedated or unconscious. The sight turned O'Brien's stomach, but when he recognized one of the women, his blood ran cold. It was Catherine Malaud, the young widow who had tirelessly searched for her missing husband, a steel worker who had vanished 6 months earlier. Week after week she had begged for answers at the foundry gates, and now here she was, limp and unresponsive, carried into the bowels of Bartholomew Crane's mansion. With dawning horror, O'Brien understood the truth. These were not willing workers or wanderers seeking a better life. This was abduction, an orchestrated system of human trafficking, operating under the very nose of Fort Wayne, feeding victims into a hidden machine of exploitation. The operation was vast, coordinated, and shielded by layers of power. Determined to expose it, O'Brien went straight to Sheriff William Hendris the following morning. But instead of concern, he was met with hostility. Hendris dismissed his story outright, bristling at the suggestion that Fort Wayne's most celebrated benefactor could be guilty of such crimes. "You're accusing the man who built half this county," the sheriff snapped, threatening O'Brien with arrest if he continued pressing the matter. Unwilling to yield, O'Brien turned to the press, approaching the Fort Wayne Gazette. Yet the editor, while polite, quickly revealed that his hands were tied. Crane's businesses supplied the paper with the bulk of its advertising revenue, and to print allegations without concrete evidence would mean financial ruin. Here, too, O'Brien ran into a brick wall of complicity. Every institution in Fort Wayne law enforcement, the newspapers, city officials, even local churches owed its survival to Crane's wealth. To challenge him was to challenge the very economic engine that sustained the city. But O'Brien was not alone in his suspicions. On the east side of Fort Wayne, Sister Margaret O'Connell, who ran the Catholic orphanage, had quietly been assembling her own records. For 2 years, she had received desperate inquiries from families whose loved ones had gone missing after seeking work or lodging tied to the Crane estates. Her notes revealed a pattern that widened the scope of the horror. It wasn't just men who disappeared, it was whole families lured by advertisements for domestic positions, then erased without a trace. When Sister Margaret visited Crane properties to ask after them, she was met by armed guards and evasive answers. The families, she was told, had moved on, though no trace of them could be found anywhere in the Midwest. What both O'Brien and Sister Margaret were beginning to see was that the vanishings were not scattered accidents, but part of a system, a machine fueled by human lives, hidden beneath the ironclad respectability of Bartholomew Crane. Sister Margaret's persistence came at a price. One winter morning, Bartholomew Crane himself appeared at the orphanage, his imposing frame filling the doorway as he presented the nun with a donation large enough to keep the institution afloat for an entire year. His voice was gentle, his manner polished, but his message unmistakable. Her duty was to the children in her care, not to the unfounded rumors surrounding his household staff. The money ensured food, shelter, and schooling for dozens of orphans, but it also came with an unspoken demand for silence. Torn between her conscience and her responsibility, Sister Margaret reluctantly backed down. By the spring of 1891, a suffocating quiet had descended over Fort Wayne. Those who suspected Crane's crimes found themselves silenced, isolated, or financially dependent on the very man they hoped to expose. The wagons still rumbled down country roads in the dead of night. The missing continued to vanish without trace, and Crane's reputation as the city's patron saint grew ever stronger. Yet beneath this enforced calm, pressure mounted. Thomas O'Brien, undeterred by threats, filled page after page of a secret journal with his observations. Sister Margaret, though publicly subdued, continued recording names and dates in private. And inside Crane's own household, questions were beginning to stir. By autumn, the once harmonious corridors of Crane Manor carried a new tension. Wives who had once walked with confidence now spoke in whispers, their eyes flicking nervously toward the wings of the mansion they were never allowed to enter. The most troubled of all was Elena Hartwell Crane's first wife. She had known him since his lean years in the late 1870s and had stood by him as he rose from steelworker to industrial giant. As senior wife, she wielded unusual influence in the household, managing staff, overseeing the children's education, and acting as Crane's hostess at grand social functions. That access gave her a view of details the others never saw, and what she found unsettled her deeply. Month after month, the household accounts crossed her desk, and the numbers told a story she could not ignore. Deliveries of food arrived in volumes far beyond what their household of wives, children, and servants could possibly consume, quantities suited for feeding hundreds. Medical supplies were ordered in bulk, suggesting a clinic or even a hospital operating within the estate, though no such institution had ever been announced publicly. And most unsettling of all, large payments were issued to unfamiliar names, individuals who never appeared at the manor and whose services were never explained. When Elena cautiously raised these discrepancies with Crane, his answers were as smooth as his steel. He spoke of facilities for visiting associates, of special medical programs for his workers. Explanations plausible enough to silence suspicion, but never sufficient to explain the sheer scale of the hidden expenses. Her unease deepened when she began noticing a quiet but deliberate shift in the household staff. Trusted longtime servants were dismissed without warning, replaced by unfamiliar men and women who worked odd hours and were assigned exclusively to the restricted wings of the manor. They rarely spoke to other staff and avoided contact with the family. At night, when the mansion was cloaked in silence, Elena sometimes heard distant sounds rising from the forbidden basements, low mechanical groans, the hiss of unseen machinery, and what she swore were muffled voices carried upward through stone. What had once been a home of wealth and order now felt more like a fortress guarding secrets too dark for daylight. And for the first time since her marriage, Elena Hartwell began to fear the man she had once believed to be her greatest protector. The voices in the dark were the first sign that the walls of Crane Manor held more than plaster and stone. Elena heard them on restless nights, foreign tongues she could not place, desperate whispers, faint weeping that might have been imagined, if not for how consistent it became. When she shared her unease with the other senior wives, she learned they too had felt the shadow creeping closer. Margaret Sullivan confided that her young children woke sobbing from dreams of sad people who lived inside the walls. Victoria Welsh revealed that her teenage daughter had glimpsed pale faces staring from the windows of supposedly abandoned wings of the manor. The women began to gather in secret convening in Elena's sitting room, where whispers carried less risk. There, piece by piece, their fragments of suspicion took shape into something monstrous. Each wife had noticed different anomalies, strange deliveries arriving at odd hours, foul chemical odors drifting through the halls, servants who appeared and vanished without introduction. It was Margaret Sullivan who made the first concrete discovery. Behind a shelf in the library, she found a narrow passage, a hidden staircase plunging far below the levels any of the wives had known existed. At the bottom, she encountered a door reinforced with locks. Pressing her ear to the wood, she heard unmistakable proof of what lay beneath coughing, crying voices, too weak to shout, and the relentless pounding of machinery. She retreated in terror, but with certainty there were people imprisoned below their home. The wives were trapped in a nightmare. To confront Crane meant risking their lives and their children, yet to remain silent meant complicity. Their dread turned to horror in December 1891, when 7-year-old Timothy Crane vanished while playing in the West Wing. Hours of frantic searching ended with the boy discovered asleep in his own bed, filthy and reeking of the same metallic stench the wives associated with the restricted wings. His cough was ragged, his throat raw as though he had been breathing smoke or fumes. When Elena gently pressed him, Timothy spoke haltingly of the working people downstairs and the sad place where nobody can leave. He described a vast room filled with captives and the deafening clang of metal. Most chilling of all, he whispered that someone had told him he would learn about the family business, but that he had been sent back because he was too small to understand. For Elena, the revelation shattered any lingering illusions. Crane had exposed his own son to whatever horrors unfolded below ground, then drugged or manipulated the boy's memory to erase the experience. If he was willing to endanger his own child, then no one in the manor was safe. The wives knew their suspicions were no longer speculation. They were sitting atop a prison and possibly a slaughterhouse. Crane's behavior soon confirmed their fears. He began questioning them about their movements, assigning unfamiliar servants to follow them, and appearing unannounced in places where they once moved freely. His smile had lost its warmth, replaced with the cold vigilance of a man certain he was being watched. The fragile balance broke in January 1892. Margaret Sullivan, restless and determined, ventured deeper into the secret passageways. What she discovered went beyond locked doors and muffled cries. It revealed the true scale of Crane's enterprise, evidence so damning that even the other wives, long accustomed to keeping silent, could no longer ignore the monstrous reality hidden beneath their gilded home. Margaret Sullivan's discovery beneath the floorboards confirmed what she and the other wives had long feared. Hidden there was a grim collection of trinkets and papers, rings, lockets, family photographs, handwritten letters. even identification documents, all belonging to people who had vanished from Fort Wayne in recent years. Among them lay a letter that made her blood run cold. A plea written by Catherine Maloud, the widowed immigrant's wife who had begged the sheriff for help finding her missing husband. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Margaret herself had seen Catherine carried drugged and limp into the forbidden depths of Crane Manor. It was no longer a question of suspicion. Their husband was no eccentric patriarch. He was a predator running a systematic campaign of abduction, a man who had turned their home into the command center of a criminal empire feeding on the vulnerable. But Margaret's revelation was only the beginning. The full scale of Bartholomew Crane's depravity would come to light through Rebecca Fleming, the wife least willing to accept silence. A former schoolteacher from Chicago, Rebecca had always carried herself with sharp intelligence and a restless independence that Crane once found charming, though he now considered it a liability. While the other wives had learned to stop asking questions, Rebecca quietly collected them, storing each inconsistency in her mind, like evidence waiting to be used. In February 1892, fate handed her an opportunity. Crane departed on a 2-week trip to Pittsburgh, leaving his household under lighter supervision than usual. For the first time, Rebecca could move without the constant shadow of his watchman. She seized the chance. For months, she had studied the manor's oddities, the false walls, the inconsistent stairwells, the additions that didn't match the original blueprints. Her late father had been an architect, and she used his teachings to trace the hidden architecture of Crane Manor. What she mapped out was staggering a basement that sprawled far beyond the visible footprint of the mansion, branching into tunnels that reached external outbuildings across the estate. Her exploration began in silence before dawn, when the rest of the family still slept. Instead of forcing the locked door at the base of the secret staircase, Margaret had discovered Rebecca searched for alternate routes, probing walls and floors, until she uncovered secondary passages that led deeper underground. What she found below stripped away any last shred of doubt. Crane's basement was no mere cellar. It was a labyrinth of chambers converted into an underground factory, complete with scaled-down steel furnaces, metalworking tools, and machines built for processing raw materials. But the horror was not in the machinery. It was in the people forced to run it. Dozens of captives labored in chains, their bodies gaunt and bruised, their eyes dulled by exhaustion and opiates. Men, women, even children were shackled to workstations, compelled to toil for 18 to 20 hours before collapsing onto straw mats strewn across damp stone floors. Rebecca recognized them. These were Fort Waynes, missing the immigrants who never made it home. The families who answered advertisements for work, the vagrants who vanished from railway camps, even townsfolk whose departures had been explained away with suspiciously neat letters. They had not left. They had been processed into living machinery to fuel Crane's empire. Crane's unmatched success, his ability to undercut competitors and avoid strikes, was no stroke of genius. It was slavery hidden behind wealth, respectability, and iron control of a city, too dependent on his fortune to question him. Rebecca's descent into the hidden heart of Crane Manor revealed not just a factory of stolen lives, but a furnace of annihilation. The prisoners who collapsed under disease or exhaustion were not released, nor were they given care. They were marched to the final chamber, where a massive furnace burned not steel, but flesh and bone. Their bodies were consumed entirely, leaving behind only the mineral ash of their skeletons. And that ash, unthinkably, was added to the steel itself. The secret behind Crane Steelworks' reputation for unmatched quality was not superior technique or rare ores. It was the dead. Human remains fused into the alloy gave his steel an unnatural durability, a strength that competitors could never replicate. Every beam, every rail, every girder stamped with Crane's name carried within it the residue of lives stolen and destroyed. Rebecca staggered beneath the realization. For 3 years she had slept peacefully above this charnel house, married to a man who smiled tenderly at his children, while burning strangers into his empire's foundation. But terror gave way to resolve. During Crane's absence, Rebecca documented everything with the precision of a teacher and the desperation of a survivor. She sketched maps of the underground labyrinth, listed the names and faces of the prisoners she could identify, and recorded the locations of the furnaces' chains and hidden passages. She knew Fort Wayne's leaders were bound to Crane by money and fear, so her only hope lay in alerting authorities beyond Indiana's borders. Yet the scale of what she had uncovered made it impossible for her to act alone. A rescue attempt would need to be massive, swift, and backed by forces beyond Crane's reach. Her search of Crane's personal papers deepened the horror. Among ledgers and coded correspondence, she discovered journals where he justified his crimes as though they were scientific triumphs. In his eyes, men, women, and children were not people but components, fuel for a new kind of industry, where flesh replaced coal and bone became alloy. He wrote of his vision to replicate the Fort Wayne model in other cities, expanding into Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan until his hidden factories spanned the nation. What he had created beneath Crane Manor was not just a crime, it was a prototype. Rebecca realized she was staring into the mind of a man who had stripped himself of empathy, morality, and humanity. He was not content to dominate Indiana's industry. He intended to reinvent labor itself, turning human lives into raw material on a scale that could devour the entire country. When Crane returned from Pittsburgh in late February 1892, Rebecca was no longer the compliant wife he expected. She was armed with knowledge, with evidence, and with a choice that would determine not just her own survival, but the fate of every captive still chained below the manor. The confrontation between husband and wife would drag the darkness of Crane Manor into the open, exposing a nightmare that Fort Wayne and America could no longer ignore. Crane's words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping away any illusion that he might still possess a trace of conscience. Rebecca felt the weight of every chained soul below her feet pressing against her chest, urging her to push forward even as terror clawed at her throat. She steadied herself, knowing she had reached the point of no return. "Superior steel built on blood and ashes is no triumph," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "It's murder and it will destroy you. If you don't release them, I will expose you. I'll go to Chicago, to Washington, anywhere beyond your reach. Someone will listen. Someone will stop you." For a long moment, silence filled the study. The crackle of the fire in the hearth was the only sound, its glow painting shifting shadows across Crane's face. Then he stood, rising slowly from behind his desk. His towering figure loomed over her, and his eyes glinted like steel cooled in darkness. "You've seen too much, Rebecca," he said softly, almost with regret. "I had hoped you would accept your place in this family. I might even have elevated you above the others. But instead, you've chosen disobedience. And disobedience, my dear, has consequences." Rebecca's heart pounded. She knew what he meant. She had seen those consequences smoldering in the furnace below. But this time she was not entirely defenseless. Hidden in the folds of her dress was a small packet, notes, sketches, and a fragment of ledger page she had taken from the underground chambers. Proof enough, she prayed, to convince outsiders, if she could get it into the right hands. "You can't silence the truth," she whispered, clutching the bundle like a talisman. "You've built your empire on lies, on bones and suffering. It won't hold forever. People will see you for what you are." Crane's smile returned, but it was no longer charming. It was a predator's grin. "You misunderstand, Rebecca. Empires are not built on truth. They are built on power. And power is something I have in abundance." He stepped toward her, and for the first time in their marriage, Rebecca felt the full force of the monster she had unmasked. Yet she did not back down. In that moment, standing in the opulent study of Crane Manor with the eyes of 100 ghosts upon her, Rebecca understood that her confrontation had set events into motion that neither she nor Crane could control. Rebecca's defiance was crushed beneath the grip of Crane's hired men. But even as they wrenched her from the study, she clung to one last thread of resistance. The bundle of papers concealed in her dress. The map of the underground chambers, the list of names, the fragments of letters and ledgers remained hidden. It was the only weapon she had left, a silent testimony to the nightmare beneath Crane Manor. As the guards forced her down the corridor, Rebecca's thoughts raced. She knew what relocation meant. She had seen the locked doors, the guarded staircases, the endless chambers below ground. She was destined to become another number in Crane's ledger. Another body fed to the furnace when her usefulness expired. Yet she also knew that the evidence she carried could outlive her, if only she could find a way to get it into the right hands. Crane watched her struggle with detached amusement, his voice calm, almost soothing, as he instructed the guards. "Be careful with her. She's intelligent, resourceful. I'll decide what to do with her once I've determined how much she's told the others." His words were not those of a husband, but of a factory manager evaluating a piece of machinery. Dragged through the hallways of the manor she once called home, Rebecca passed portraits of Crane's family, their painted smiles now grotesque reminders of the lie she had lived. She thought of Eleanor, Margaret, Victoria, and the others' wives who were now in mortal danger because she had spoken their names. She thought of the children who played above while prisoners wept below. And she thought of the sound of steel striking steel in the hidden factory, a rhythm of suffering that would continue unless someone stopped him. That night marked a turning point. Rebecca had failed to escape, but she had planted the seed of Crane's downfall. The evidence she carried would not remain buried forever. In time, those papers, maps drawn by a teacher's hand, names written in a wife's careful script would surface. And when they did, the story of Bartholomew Crane's empire of ash and steel would begin to unravel. The confrontation in February 1892 was not the end of Rebecca Fleming, nor the beginning of her liberation. It was the moment the struggle shifted from secret suspicion to open war within the walls of Crane Manor, a war between a man who saw people as raw material and a woman determined that their suffering would not remain hidden forever. The storm that Rebecca had tried to raise alone finally broke in March of 1892, and it came with a force even Bartholomew Crane could not contain. For 3 weeks after her failed confrontation, Crane Manor became a gilded prison. Armed guards patrolled the halls, children were held as leverage, and the wives, once the ornaments of Indiana society, were reduced to hostages in their own home. Screams echoed from the basement, mingled with the pounding of machinery, a constant reminder of the suffering below. But while Crane tightened his grip on the manor, cracks were spreading beyond his reach. The first came from Sister Margaret O'Connell, whose conscience finally outweighed her fear. She wrote to Washington, sending her carefully compiled records of vanished families to the Bureau of Investigation. Her letter landed on the desk of Special Agent Daniel Kowalski, a determined investigator with a keen eye for patterns. What local sheriffs had dismissed as unrelated disappearances, Kowalski recognized as the telltale signature of an organized network. Fort Wayne was its epicenter. The second came from Thomas O'Brien, the steel foreman, who had risked everything to keep his journal of the wagons, the missing men, and the strange shifts at the foundry. When Kowalski contacted him, O'Brien turned over the entire record, including his eyewitness account of watching people delivered to Crane Manor in the dead of night. His journal became the backbone of the case. And then came the physician. Dr. Harrison Peaton had long been puzzled by the patients referred to him from Crane's businesses. They arrived malnourished, scarred, and broken with injuries that spoke of chains and environments no free workers should endure. He suspected something was wrong, but had no proof until Kowalski's investigation gave him the context he needed. His medical records cross-referenced with O'Brien's journal, and Sister Margaret's files built a damning picture. The disappearances were not accidents. They were the machinery of an empire. The Bureau acted swiftly. At dawn on March 15, 1892, federal agents reinforced by soldiers from Fort Benjamin Harrison encircled Crane Manor. Every exit was sealed, every guardhouse secured. Agents stormed the mansion, finding Crane in his study, calmly feeding incriminating documents into the fire. He was arrested before he could finish. What agents uncovered below ground horrified even hardened men. The labyrinth of chambers stretched farther than anyone had guessed, filled with machines' tools and the emaciated figures of the enslaved. Survivors blinked in disbelief at the sudden arrival of uniforms and rifles, unable at first to accept that their captivity had ended. Some clung to their chains, unwilling to leave for fear of punishment. Others sobbed their voices raw from years of silence. When the furnace was discovered, its purpose unmistakable. Several agents staggered back, pale and retching. The very steel that had built Crane's fortune had been forged with the ashes of his victims. The rescue operation grew into a humanitarian mission that stretched the limits of the young Bureau. Doctors treated Burns' malnutrition and chemical poisoning. Translators struggled to communicate with prisoners pulled from half a dozen states and half a dozen countries. Social workers attempted to reunite survivors with families, though for many there were no families left. What had begun as a criminal raid had become something larger, the exposure of one of the most grotesque enterprises in American history. Crane's arrest shattered the illusion of respectability he had cultivated for decades. The man hailed as Indiana's steel baron, admired for his extended family and philanthropic gifts, stood revealed as a predator who turned human lives into industry. But while the federal raid ended his reign, the legacy of his crimes, the families destroyed, the bodies turned to ash. The trauma etched into survivors would linger long after the fires of Crane Manor went cold. The liberation of Crane Manor's prisoners was only the beginning. Many survivors were carried straight from the underground chambers to waiting wagons bound for hospitals, their bodies little more than skin and bone, their eyes hollow from years in darkness. Among them was Rebecca Fleming. Though frail and scarred by 3 weeks of captivity, she clung to life with the same determination that had driven her to expose Crane in the first place. When investigators recovered the documents, she had hidden behind his desk maps of the tunnels, lists of names, fragments of his own ledgers. Rebecca's courage was vindicated. Her testimony, paired with the evidence she preserved, became the cornerstone of the federal case. The investigation revealed the true breadth of Bartholomew Crane's reign of terror. Over 5 years, more than 400 men, women and children had been kidnapped and forced into servitude beneath Crane Manor. Fewer than 100 lived to see the light of day again. The rest had perished from exhaustion, untreated illness, industrial accidents, or deliberate execution when they became too weak to work. It was not just a factory of steel. It was a factory of death. The trial that followed riveted the nation. Newspapers dubbed it the case of the century, printing lurid accounts of the furnaces, the chains, the screams echoing through the manor walls. Survivors gave heartbreaking testimony, describing years of captivity, the loss of their families, and the horrors of watching fellow prisoners consumed by the furnace. Prosecutors presented ledgers in Crane's own hand, detailing the dates of acquisition and the processing of victims as if they were raw materials. Crane's defense argued madness, that no sane man could conceive such a system. But the precision of his records, the sophistication of his underground facilities, and the scale of the network that spanned multiple states revealed a mind not unhinged, but methodically calculating. The jury took less than 2 hours to return guilty on every charge: kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. On November 3, 1892, Bartholomew Crane was hanged in the yard of the Indiana State Prison. He died as he had lived, cold and unrepentant. His final words, delivered with a chilling calm, were not of remorse, but of pride. "History will remember me as a pioneer of efficiency." For him, even in the shadow of the gallows, people were never more than tools. But the execution did not end the ordeal for those left behind. Crane's surviving wives and children faced a future clouded by shame and suspicion. Stripped of wealth and property, they struggled to rebuild lives under the crushing weight of association with a man now remembered as one of America's darkest figures. Some changed their names and fled Indiana, desperate to escape the shadow of Crane Manor. Others stayed working quietly to support survivors and atone for the horrors they had unwittingly lived above. The ruins of Crane Manor stood for decades as a grim reminder of what had been uncovered there. Eventually it was torn down, its foundations leveled, but the memory of what lay beneath could never be erased. The story of Bartholomew Crane endures not as a tale of progress and industry, but as a warning of how power left unchecked can twist ambition into atrocity. Although Crane's surviving wives were cleared of any involvement in his crimes, they carried the lifelong burden of having unknowingly lived above one of the darkest criminal enterprises in American history. Ellen Hartwell and several others chose to change their names and move far from Indiana, attempting to build new lives beyond the shadow of Crane Manor. Rebecca Fleming, whose bravery in confronting her husband had been instrumental in exposing his empire of suffering, never remarried. Instead, she devoted the rest of her life to advocacy, working with federal authorities to strengthen investigations into organized crime and human trafficking. She became a voice for the silenced, ensuring that the memory of Crane's victims would never fade. The Crane Steelworks was permanently shuttered, its machinery dismantled, and the mansion that had served as the beating heart of his operations was demolished by federal order. In its place rose a memorial garden where the names of Crane's known victims were carved into stone markers. Families who had once lived in anguish finally had a place to mourn, and the site became a stark reminder of what unchecked ambition and moral corruption could destroy. The case of Bartholomew Crane forever changed the nation's understanding of crime and industry. It prompted new federal laws regulating labor practices, harsher penalties for kidnapping and trafficking, and clear protocols for federal authorities to intervene when crimes crossed state lines. The Bureau of Investigation, whose agents had uncovered the horrors beneath Crane Manor, was expanded and empowered, laying the groundwork for what would one day become the FBI. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson was not in the courtroom or in Congress, but in the warning his story carved into American memory. Crane had been celebrated as a titan of industry, a benefactor of charities, a family man. His crimes prove that respectability can be the perfect disguise for evil, and that entire communities can be blinded by wealth and reputation, while darkness thrives in their midst. The legacy of Bartholomew Crane's atrocities still resonates as a reminder that true evil rarely announces itself. It often hides behind polished manners and smiling faces, and it also stands as testament to the courage of ordinary people. Rebecca Fleming, Thomas O'Brien, Sister Margaret O'Connell, who refused to stay silent and risked everything to bring the truth to light. Even in America's gilded age of prosperity and progress, the shadows of human cruelty stretched long, reminding us that no matter how bright the facade, darkness can always find a place to grow. So what do you think? Could crimes of this scale really go undetected for so long? And what does this story say about the courage it takes for ordinary people to stand against extraordinary evil? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this with someone who loves a chilling mystery, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the stories that history tried to bury.